Chapter 12 of My Life and Work. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adam Marsatich, Alexandria, Virginia, June 2010. My Life and Work by Henry Ford, in collaboration with Samuel Crowther. Chapter 12. Money, Master or Servant. In December 1920, business the country over was marking time. More automobile plants were closed than were open, and quite a number of those which were closed were completely in the charge of bankers. Rumors of bad financial condition were afloat concerning nearly every industrial company, and I became interested when the reports persisted that the Ford Motor Company not only needed money but could not get it. I have become accustomed to all kinds of rumors about our company, so much so that nowadays I rarely deny any sort of rumor, but these reports differed from all previous ones. They were so exact and circumstantial. I learned that I had to overcome my prejudice against borrowing, and that I might be found almost any day down in Wall Street, hat in hand, asking for money. And rumor went even further and said that no one would give me money, and that I might have to break up and go out of business. It is true that we did have a problem. In 1919 we had borrowed $70 million on notes to buy the full stock interest in the Ford Motor Company. On this, we had $33 million left to pay. We had $18 million in income taxes due or shortly to become due to the government, and also we intended to pay our usual bonus for the year to the workmen, which amounted to $7 million. Altogether, between January 1st and April 18, 1921, we had payments ahead totaling $58 million. We had only $20 million in the bank. Our balance sheet was more or less common knowledge, and I suppose it was taken for granted that we could not raise the $38 million needed without borrowing, for that is quite a large sum of money. Without the aid of Wall Street, such a sum could not easily and quickly be raised. We were perfectly good for the money. 2 years before, we had borrowed $70 million, and since our whole property was unencumbered and we had no commercial debts, the matter of lending a large sum to us would not ordinarily have been a matter of moment. In fact, it would have been good banking business. However, I began to see that our need for money was being industriously circulated as evidence of impending failure. Then I began to suspect that, although the rumors came in news dispatches from all over the country, they might perhaps be traced to a single source. The belief was further strengthened when we were informed that a very fat financial editor was at Battle Creek sending out bulletins concerning the acuteness of our financial condition. Therefore, I took care not to deny a single rumor. We had made our financial plans and they did not include borrowing money. I cannot too greatly emphasize that the very worst time to borrow money is when the banking people think that you need money. In the last chapter, I outlined our financial principles. We simply applied those principles. We planned a thorough house cleaning. Go back a bit and see what the conditions were. Along in the early part of 1920 came the first indications that the feverish speculative business engendered by the war was not going to continue. A few concerns that had sprung out of the war and had no real reason for existence failed. People slowed down in their buying. Our own sales kept right along, but we knew that sooner or later they would drop off. I thought seriously of cutting prices, but the costs of manufacturing everywhere were out of control. Labor gave less and less in return for high wages. The suppliers of raw material refused even to think of coming back to earth. The very plain warnings of the storm went quite unheeded. In June our own sales began to be affected. They grew less and less each month from June on until September. We had to do something to bring our product within the purchasing power of the public, and not only that, we had to do something drastic enough to demonstrate to the public that we were actually playing the game and not just shamming. Therefore in September we cut the price of the touring car from $575 to $440. We cut the price far below the cost of production, for we were still making from stock bought at boom prices. The cut created a considerable sensation. We received a deal of criticism. It was said that we were disturbing conditions. That is exactly what we were trying to do. We wanted to do our part in bringing prices from an artificial to a natural level. I am firmly of the opinion that if at this time or earlier manufacturers and distributors had all made drastic cuts in their prices and had put through thorough house cleanings, we should not have so long a business depression. Hanging on in the hope of getting higher prices simply delayed adjustment. Nobody got the higher prices they hoped for, and if the losses had been taken all at once, not only would the productive and the buying powers of the country have become harmonized, but we should have been saved this long period of general idleness. Hanging on in the hope of higher prices merely made the losses greater, because those who hung on had to pay interest on their high-priced stocks, and also lost the profits they might have made by working on a sensible basis. Unemployment cut down wage distribution, and thus the buyer and the seller became more and more separated. There was a lot of flurried talk of arranging to give vast credits to Europe, the idea being that thereby the high-priced stocks might be palmed off. Of course, the proposals were not put in any such crude fashion, and I think that quite a lot of people sincerely believed that if large credits were extended abroad, even without a hope of the payment of either principal or interest, American business would somehow be benefited. It is true that if these credits were taken by American banks, those who had high-priced stocks might have gotten rid of them at a profit, but the banks would have acquired so much frozen credit that they would have more nearly resembled ice houses than banks. I suppose it is natural to hang on to the possibility of profits until the very last moment, but it is not good business. Our own sales, after the cut, increased, but soon they began to fall off again. We were not sufficiently within the purchasing power of the country to make buying easy. Retail prices generally had not touched bottom. The public distrusted all prices. We laid our plans for another cut, and we kept our production around 100,000 cars a month. This production was not justified by our sales, but we wanted to have as much as possible of our raw material transformed into finished product before we shut down. We knew that we would have to shut down in order to take an inventory and clean house. We wanted to open with another big cut and to have cars on hand to supply the demand. Then the new cars could be built out of material bought at lower prices. We determined that we were going to get lower prices. We shut down in December with the intention of opening again in about 2 weeks. We found so much to do that actually we did not open for nearly 6 weeks. The moment that we shut down, The rumors concerning our financial condition became more and more active. I know that a great many people hoped that we should have to go out after money. For, were we seeking money, then we should have come to terms. We did not ask for money. We did not want money. We had one offer of money. An officer of a New York bank called on me with a financial plan which included a large loan, and in which also was an arrangement by which a representative of the bankers would act as treasurer and take charge of the finance of the company. Those people meant well enough, I am quite sure. We did not want to borrow money, but it so happened that at the moment we were without a treasurer. To that extent the bankers had envisaged our condition correctly. I asked my son Edsel to be treasurer as well as president of the company. That fixed us up as to a treasurer, so there was really nothing at all that the bankers could do for us. Then we began our house cleaning. During the war we had gone into many kinds of war work and had thus been forced to depart from our principle of a single product. This had caused many new departments to be added. The office force had expanded, and much of the wastefulness of scattered production had crept in. War work is rush work and is wasteful work. We began throwing out everything that did not contribute to the production of cars. The only immediate payment scheduled was the purely voluntary one of a $7 million bonus to our workmen. There was no obligation to pay, but we wanted to pay on the 1st of January. That we paid out of our cash on hand. Throughout the country we have had 35 branches. These are all assembling plants, but in 22 of them parts are also manufactured. They had stopped the making of parts, but they went on assembling cars. At the time of shutting down, we had practically no cars in Detroit. We had shipped out all the parts, and during January the Detroit dealers actually had to go as far afield as Chicago and Columbus to get cars for local needs. The branches shipped to each dealer, under his yearly quota, enough cars to cover about a month's sales. The dealers worked hard on sales. During the latter part of January we called in a skeleton organization of about 10,000 men, mostly foremen, sub-foremen, and straw bosses, and we started Highland Park into production. We collected our foreign accounts and sold our by-products. Then we were ready for full production, and gradually into full production we went, on a profitable basis. The house cleaning swept out the waste that had both made the prices high and absorbed the profits. We sold off the useless stuff. Before we had employed 15 men per car per day. Afterward we employed 9 per car per day. This did not mean that 6 out of 15 men lost their jobs. They only ceased being unproductive. We made that cut by applying the rule that everything and everybody must produce or get out. We cut our office forces in halves, and offered the office workers better jobs in the shops. Most of them took the jobs. We abolished every order blank and every form of statistics that did not directly aid in the production of a car. We had been collecting tons of statistics, because they were interesting, but statistics will not construct automobiles, so out they went. We took out 60% of our telephone extensions. Only a comparatively few men in any organization need telephones. We formerly had a foreman for every 5 men. Now we have a foreman for every 20 men. The other foremen are working on machines. We cut the overhead charge from $146 a car to $93 a car, and when you realize what this means on more than 4,000 cars a day, you will have an idea how. not by economy, not by wage cutting, but by the elimination of waste, it is possible to make an impossible price. Most important of all, we found out how to use less money in our business by speeding up the turnover. And in increasing the turnover rate, one of the most important factors was the Detroit, Toledo and Ironton Railroad, which we purchased. The railroad took a large place in the scheme of economy. To the road itself I have given another chapter. We discovered, after a little experimenting, that freight service could be improved sufficiently to reduce the cycle of manufacture from 22 to 14 days. That is, raw material could be bought, manufactured, and the finished product put into the hands of the distributor in roughly 33% less time than before. We had been carrying an inventory of around $60 million to ensure uninterrupted production. Cutting down the time one-third released $20 million or $1.2 million a year on interest. Counting the finished inventory, we saved approximately $8 million more. That is, we were able to release $28 million in capital and save the interest on that sum. On January 1st, we had $20 million. On April 1st, we had $87.3 million or $27.3 million more than we needed to wipe out all our indebtedness. That is what boring into the business did for us. This amount came to us in these terms. Cash on hand, January, $20 million. Stock on hand turned into cash January 1 to April 1, $24.7 million. Speeding up transit of goods released $28 million. Collected from agents in foreign countries, $3 million. Sale of byproducts, $3.7 million. Sale of Liberty bonds, $7.9 million. Total, $87.3 million. Now, I have told about all this not in the way of an exploit, but to point out how a business may find resources within itself instead of borrowing, and also to start a little thinking as to whether the form of our money may not put a premium on borrowing, and thus give too far great a place in life to the bankers. We could have borrowed $40 million more had we wanted to. Suppose we had borrowed. What would have happened? Should we have been better fitted to go on with our business, or worse fitted? If we had borrowed, should we not have been under the necessity of finding methods to cheapen production? Had we been able to obtain the money at 6% flat, and we should in commissions and the like have had to pay more than that, the interest charge alone on a yearly production of 500,000 cars would have amounted to about $4 a car. Therefore, we should now be without the benefit of better production and loaded with a heavy debt. Our cars would probably cost about $100 more than they do. Hence, we should have a smaller production, for we could not have so many buyers. We should employ fewer men, and in short, should not be able to serve to the utmost. You will note that the financiers proposed to cure by lending money and not by bettering methods. They did not suggest putting in an engineer. They wanted to put in a treasurer. And that is the danger of having bankers in business. They think solely in terms of money. They think of a factory as making money, not goods. They want to watch the money, not the efficiency of production. They cannot comprehend that a business never stands still. It must go forward or go back. They regard a reduction in prices as a throwing away of profit instead of as building a business. Bankers play far too great a part in the conduct of industry. Most business men will privately admit that fact. They will seldom publicly admit it because they are afraid of their bankers. It required less skill to make a fortune dealing in money than dealing in production. The average successful banker is by no means so intelligent and resourceful a man as is the average successful businessman. Yet the banker, through his control of credit, practically controls the average businessman. There has been great teaching out by bankers in the last 15 or 20 years, and especially since the war, and the Federal Reserve System for a time put into their hands an almost limitless supply of credit. The banker is, as I have noted, by training and because of his position, totally unsuited to the conduct of industry. If, therefore, the controllers of credit have lately acquired this very large power, is it not to be taken as a sign that there is something wrong with the financial system that gives to finance instead of to service the predominant power in industry? It is not the industrial acumen of the bankers that brought them into the management of industry. Everyone will admit that. They were pushed there, willy-nilly, by the system itself. Therefore, I personally want to discover whether we are operating under the best financial system. Now, let me say at once that my objection to bankers has nothing to do with personality. I am not against bankers as such. We stand very much in need of thoughtful men skilled in finance. The world cannot go on without banking facilities. We have to have money. We have to have credit. Otherwise the fruits of production could not be exchanged. We have to have capital. Without it, there could be no production. But whether we have based our banking and our credit on the right foundation is quite another matter. It is no part of my thought to attack our financial system. I am not in the position of one who has been beaten by the system and wants revenge. It does not make the least difference to me personally what bankers do, because we have been able to manage our affairs without outside financial aid. My inquiry is prompted by no personal motive whatsoever. I only want to know whether the greatest good is being rendered to the greatest number. No financial system is good which favors one class of producers over another. We want to discover whether it is not possible to take away power which is not based on wealth creation. Any sort of class legislation is pernicious. I think that the country's production has become so changed in its methods that gold is not the best medium with which it may be measured, and that the gold standard as a control of credit gives, as is now, and I believe inevitably administered, class advantage. The ultimate check on credit is the amount of gold in the country, regardless of the amount of wealth in the country. I am not prepared to dogmatize on the subject of money or credit. As far as money and credit are concerned, no one as yet knows enough about them to dogmatize. The whole question will have to be settled, as all other questions of real importance have to be settled, and that is by cautious, well-founded experiment. And I am not inclined to go beyond cautious experiments. We have to proceed step by step and very carefully. The question is not political, it is economic, and I am perfectly certain that helping the people to think on the question is wholly advantageous. They will not act without adequate knowledge, and thus cause disaster, if a sincere effort is made to provide them with knowledge. The money question has first place in multitudes of minds of all degrees or power. But a glance at most of the cure-all systems shows how contradictory they are. The majority of them make the assumption of honesty among mankind to begin with, and that, of course, is a prime defect. Even our present system would work splendidly if all men were honest. As a matter of fact, the whole money question is 95% human nature, and your successful system must check human nature, not depend upon it. The people are thinking about the money question, and if the money masters have any information which they think the people ought to have to prevent them going astray, now is the time to give it. The days are fast slipping away when the fear of credit curtailment will avail, or when wordy slogans will affright. The people are naturally conservative. They are more conservative than the financiers. Those who believe that the people are so easily led that they would permit printing presses to run off money like milk tickets do not understand them. It is the innate conservation of the people that has kept our money good in spite of the fantastic tricks which the financiers play, and which they cover up with high technical terms. The people are on the side of sound money. They are so unalterably on the side of sound money that it is a serious question how they would regard the system under which they live if they once knew what the initiated can do without. The present money system is not going to be changed by speech making or political sensationalism or economic experiment. It is going to change under the pressure of conditions, conditions that we cannot control and pressure that we cannot control. The conditions are now with us. That pressure is now upon us. The people must be helped to think naturally about money. They must be told what it is, and what makes it money, and what are the possible tricks of the present system which put nations and peoples under control of the few. Money, after all, is extremely simple. It is part of our transportation system. It is a simple and direct method of conveying goods from one person to another. Money is in itself most admirable. It is essential. It is not intrinsically evil. It is one of the most useful devices in social life. And when it does what it was intended to do, it is all help and no hindrance. But money should always be money. A foot is always 12 inches, but when is a dollar a dollar? If ton weights changed in the coal yard and peck measures changed in the grocery, and yardsticks were today 42 inches and tomorrow 33 inches by some occult process called exchange, the people would mighty soon remedy that. When a dollar is not always a dollar, when the 100-cent dollar becomes the 65-cent dollar, and then the 50-cent dollar, and then the 47-cent dollar, as the good old American gold and silver dollars did, what is the use of yelling about cheap money, depreciated money? A dollar that stays 100 cents is as necessary as a pound that stays 16 ounces, and a yard that stays 36 inches. The bankers who do straight banking should regard themselves as naturally the first men to probe and understand our monetary system. Instead of being content with the mastery of local banking house methods, and if they would deprive the gamblers in bank balances of the name of banker and oust them once for all from the place of influence which that name gives them, banking would be restored and established as the public service it ought to be, and the iniquities of the present monetary system and financial devices would be lifted from the shoulders of the people. There is an "if" here, of course, but it is not insurmountable. Affairs are coming to a jam as it is, and if those who possess technical facility do not engage to remedy the case, those who lack that facility may attempt it. Nothing is more foolish than for any class to assume that progress is an attack upon it. Progress is only a call made upon it to lend its experience for the general advancement. It is only those who are unwise who will attempt to obstruct progress and thereby become its victims. All of us are here together, all of us must go forward together. It is perfectly silly for any man or class to take umbrage at the stirring of progress. If financiers feel that progress is only the restlessness of weak-minded persons, if they regard all suggestions of betterment as a personal slap, then they are taking the part which proves more than anything else could their unfitness to continue in their leadership. If the present faulty system is more profitable to a financier than a more perfect system would be, and if that financier values his few remaining years of personal profits more highly than he would value the honor of making a contribution to the life of the world by helping to erect a better system, then there is no way of preventing a clash of interests. But it is fair to say to the selfish financial interests that, if their fight is waged to perpetuate a system just because it profits them, then their fight is already lost. Why should finance fear? The world will still be here. Men will do business with one another. There will be money and there will be need of masters in the mechanism of money. Nothing is going to depart but the knots and tangles. There will be some readjustments, of course. Banks will no longer be the masters of industry. They will be the servants of industry. Business will control money instead of money controlling business. The ruinous interest system will be greatly modified. Banking will not be a risk, but a service. Banks will begin to do much more for the people than they do now, and instead of being the most expensive business in the world to manage, and the most highly profitable in the matter of dividends, they will become less costly, and the profits of their operation will go to the community which they serve. Two facts of the old order are fundamental. First, that within the nation itself the tendency of financial control is towards its largest centralized banking institutions, either a government bank or a closely allied group of private financiers. There is always in every nation a definite control of credit by private or semi-public interests. Second, in the world as a whole, the same centralizing tendency is operative. An American credit is under control of New York interests, as before the war world credit was controlled in London. The British pound sterling was the standard of exchange for the world's trade. Two methods of reform are open to us, one beginning at the bottom and one beginning at the top. The latter is the more orderly way, the former is being tried in Russia. If our reform should begin at the top, it will require a social vision and an altruistic fervor of a sincerity and intensity which is wholly inconsistent with selfish shrewdness. The wealth of the world neither consists in nor is adequately represented by the money of the world. Gold itself is not a valuable commodity. It is no more wealth than hat checks are hats. But it can be so manipulated as the sign of wealth as to give its owners or controllers the whip hand over the credit which producers of real wealth require. Dealing in money, the commodity of exchange, is a very lucrative business. When money itself becomes an article of commerce to be bought and sold before real wealth can be moved or exchanged, the usurers and speculators are thereby permitted to lay a tax on production. The hold which controllers of money are able to maintain on productive forces is seen to be more powerful, when it is remembered that, although money is supposed to represent the real wealth of the world, there is always much more wealth than there is money, and real wealth is often compelled to wait upon money, thus leading to that most paradoxical situation, a world filled with wealth but suffering want. These facts are not merely fiscal to be cast into figures and left there. They are instinct with human destiny and they bleed. The poverty of the world is seldom caused by lack of goods but by a money stringency, commercial competition between nations which leads to international rivalry and ill will, which in their turn breed wars. These are some of the human significations of these facts. Thus poverty and war, two great preventable evils, grow on a single stem. Let us see if a beginning toward a better method cannot be made. End of chapter 12. #13 of My Life and Work. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adam Marsatich, Alexandria, Virginia, June 2010. My Life and Work by Henry Ford, in collaboration with Samuel Crowther. Chapter 13. Why be poor? Poverty springs from a number of sources, the more important of which are controllable. So does special privilege. I think it is entirely feasible to abolish both poverty and special privilege, and there can be no question but that their abolition is desirable. Both are unnatural, but it is work, not law, to which we must look for results. By poverty I mean the lack of reasonably sufficient food, housing, and clothing for an individual or a family. There will have to be differences in the grades of sustenance. Men are not equal in mentality or in physique. Any plan which starts with the assumption that men are or ought to be equal is unnatural and therefore unworkable. There can be no feasible or desirable process of leveling down. Such a course only promotes poverty by making it universal instead of exceptional. Forcing the efficient producer to become inefficient does not make the inefficient producer more efficient. Poverty can be done away with only by plenty, and we have now gone far enough along in the science of production to be able to see, as a natural development, the day when production and distribution will be so scientific that all may have according to ability and industry. The extreme socialists went wide of the mark in their reasoning that industry would inevitably crush the worker. Modern industry is gradually lifting the worker and the world. We only need to know more about planning and methods. The best results can and will be brought about by individual initiative and ingenuity, by intelligent individual leadership. The government, because it is essentially negative, cannot give positive aid to any really constructive program. It can give negative aid by removing obstructions to progress and by ceasing to be a burden upon the community. The underlying causes of poverty, as I can see them, are essentially due to the bad adjustment between production and distribution, in both industry and agriculture, between the source of power and its application. The wastes due to lack of adjustment are stupendous. All of these wastes must fall before intelligent leadership consecrated to service. So long as leadership thinks more of money than it does of service, the waste will continue. Waste is prevented by far-sighted, not by short-sighted men. Short-sighted men think first of money. They cannot see waste. They think of service as altruistic instead of as the most practical thing in the world. They cannot get far enough away from the little things to see the big things, to see the biggest thing of all, which is that opportunist production, from a purely money standpoint, is the least profitable. Service can be based upon altruism, but that sort of service is not usually the best. The sentimental trips up the practical. It is not that the industrial enterprises are unable fairly to distribute a share of the wealth which they create. It is simply that the waste is so great that there is not a sufficient share for everyone engaged, notwithstanding the fact that the product is usually sold at so high a price as to restrict its fullest consumption. Take some of the wastes. Take the wastes of power. The Mississippi Valley is without coal. Through its center pour many millions of potential horsepower, the Mississippi River. But if the people by its banks want power or heat, they buy coal that has been hauled hundreds of miles, and consequently has to be sold at far above its worth as heat or power. Or if they cannot afford to buy this expensive coal, they go out and cut down trees, thereby depriving themselves of one of the greatest conservers of water power. Until recently they never thought of the power at hand which, at next to nothing beyond the initial cost, could heat, light, cook, and work for the huge population which that valley is destined to support. The cure of poverty is not in personal economy, but in better production. The thrift and economy ideas have been overworked. The word economy represents a fear. The great and tragic fact of waste is impressed on a mind by some circumstance, usually of a most materialistic kind. There comes a violent reaction against extravagance. The mind catches hold of the idea of economy. But it only flies from a greater to a lesser evil. It does not make the full journey from error to truth. Economy is the rule of half-alive minds. There can be no doubt that it is better than waste. Neither can there be any doubt that it is not as good as use. People who pride themselves on their economy take it as a virtue. But what is more pitiable than a poor, pinched mind spending the rich days and years clutching a few bits of metal? What can be fine about paring the necessities of life to the very quick? We all know economical people who seem to be niggardly even about the amount of air they breathe and the amount of appreciation they will allow themselves to give to anything. They shrivel, body and soul. Economy is waste. It is the waste of the juices of life, the sap of living. For there are two kinds of waste. That of the prodigal who throws his substance away in riotous living, and that of the sluggard who allows his substance to rot from non-use. The rigid economizer is in danger of being classed with the sluggard. Extravagance is usually a reaction from suppression of expenditure. Economy is likely to be a reaction from extravagance. Everything was given us to use. There is no evil from which we suffer that did not come about through misuse. The worst sin we can commit against the things of our common life is to misuse them. Misuse is the wider term. We like to say waste, but waste is only one phase of misuse. All waste is misuse, all misuse is waste. It is possible even to overemphasize the saving habit. It is proper and desirable that everyone have a margin. It is really wasteful not to have one, if you can have one, but it can be overdone. We teach children to save their money. As an attempt to counteract thoughtless and selfish expenditure, that has a value. But it is not positive. It does not lead the child out into the safe and useful avenues of self-expression or self-expenditure. To teach a child to invest and use is better than to teach him to save. Most men who are laboriously saving a few dollars would do better to invest those few dollars, first in themselves, and then in some useful work. Eventually they would have more to save. Young men ought to invest rather than save. They ought to invest in themselves to increase creative value. After they have taken themselves to the peak of usefulness, then will be the time enough to think of laying aside, as a fixed policy, a certain substantial share of income. You are not saving when you prevent yourself from becoming more productive. You are really taking away from your ultimate capital. You are reducing the value of one of nature's investments. The principle of use is the true guide. Use is positive, active, life-giving. Use is alive. Use adds to the sum of good. Personal want may be avoided without changing the general condition. Wage increases, price increases, profit increases, other kinds of increases designed to bring more money here or money there are only attempts of this or that class to get out of the fire, regardless of what may happen to everyone else. There is a foolish belief that if only the money can be gotten, somehow the storm can be weathered. Labor believes that if it can get more wages, it can weather the storm. Capital thinks that if it can get more profits, it can weather the storm. There is a pathetic faith in what money can do. Money is very useful in normal times, but money has no more value than the people put into it by production, and it can be so misused. It can be so superstitiously worshipped as a substitute for real wealth as to destroy its value altogether. The idea persists that there exists an essential conflict between industry and the farm. There is no such conflict. It is nonsense to say that because the cities are overcrowded, everybody ought to go back to the farm. If everybody did so, farming would soon decline as a satisfactory occupation. It is not more sensible for everyone to flock to the manufacturing towns. If the farms be deserted, of what use are manufacturers? A reciprocity can exist between farming and manufacturing. The manufacturer can give the farmer what he needs to be a good farmer, and the farmer and other producers of raw materials can give the manufacturer what he needs to be a good manufacturer. Then with transportation as a messenger, we shall have a stable and a sound system built on service. If we live in smaller communities where the tension of living is not so high, and where the products of the fields and gardens can be had without the interference of so many profiteers, there will be little poverty or unrest. Look at this whole matter of seasonal work. Take building as an example of a seasonal trade. What a waste of power it is to allow builders to hibernate through the winter, waiting for the building season to come around. And what an equal waste of skill it is to force experienced artisans who have gone into factories to escape the loss of the winter season to stay in the factory jobs through the building season because they are afraid they may not get their factory places back in the winter. What a waste this all-year system has been! If the farmer could get away from the shop to till his farm in the planting, growing, and harvesting seasons (they are only a small part of the year, after all), and if the builder could get away from the shop to ply his useful trade in its season, how much better they would be, and how much more smoothly the world would proceed. Suppose we all moved outdoors every spring and summer and lived the wholesome life of the outdoors for 3 or 4 months. We could not have slack times. The farm has its dull season. That is the time for the farmer to come into the factory and help produce the things he needs to till the farm. The factory also has its dull season. That is the time for the workmen to go out to the land to help produce food. Thus we might take the slack out of work and restore the balance between the artificial and the natural. But not the least benefit would be the more balanced view of life we should thus obtain. The mixing of the arts is not only beneficial in a material way, but it makes for breadth of mind and fairness of judgment. A great deal of our unrest today is the result of narrow prejudiced judgment. If our work were more diversified, if we saw more sides of life, if we saw how necessary was one factor to another, we should be more balanced. Every man is better for a period of work under the open sky. It is not at all impossible. What is desirable and right is never impossible. It would only mean a little teamwork, a little less attention to greedy ambition, and a little more attention to life. Those who are rich find it desirable to go away for 3 or 4 months a year and dawdle in idleness around some fancy winter or summer resort. The rank and file of the American people would not waste their time that way even if they could. But they would provide the teamwork necessary for an outdoor seasonal employment. It is hardly possible to doubt that much of the unrest we see about us is a result of unnatural modes of life. Men who do the same thing continuously the year around are shut away from the health of the sun and the spaciousness of the great out of doors, are hardly to be blamed if they see matters in a distorted light, and that applies equally to the capitalist and the worker. What is there in life that should hamper normal and wholesome modes of living? And what is there in industry incompatible with all the arts receiving in their turn the attention of those qualified to serve them? It may be objected that if the forces of industry were withdrawn from the shops every summer, it would impede production. But we must look at the matter from a universal point of view. We must consider the increased energy of the industrial forces after 3 or 4 months in outdoor work. We must also consider the effect on the cost of living which would result from a general return to the fields. We have, as I indicated in a previous chapter, been working towards this combination of farm and factory, and with entirely satisfactory results. At Northville, not far from Detroit, we have a little factory making valves. It is a little factory, but it makes a great many valves. Both the management and the mechanism of the plant are comparatively simple because it makes but one thing. We do not have to search for skilled employees. The skill is in the machine. The people of the countryside can work in the plant part of the time and on the farm part of the time, for mechanical farming is not very laborious. The plant power is derived from water. Another plant on a somewhat larger scale is in building at Flat Rock, about 15 miles from Detroit. We have dammed the river. The dam also serves as a bridge for the Detroit, Toledo and Ironton Railway, which was in need of a new bridge at that point, and a road for the public, all in one construction. We are going to make our glass at this point. The damming of the river gives sufficient water for the floating to us of most of our raw material. It also gives us our power through a hydroelectric plant, and, Being well out in the midst of the farming country, there can be no possibility of crowding or any of the ills incident to too great a concentration of population. The men will have plots of ground or farms as well as their jobs in the factory, and these can be scattered over 15 or 20 miles surrounding. For of course nowadays the working man can come to the shop in an automobile. There we shall have the combination of agriculture and industrialism and the entire absence of all the evils of concentration. The belief that an industrial country has to concentrate its industries is not, in my opinion, well founded. That is only a stage in industrial development. As we learn more about manufacturing and learn to make articles with interchangeable parts, then those parts can be made under the best possible conditions. And these best possible conditions, as far as the employees are concerned, are also the best possible conditions from the manufacturing standpoint. One could not put a great plant on a little stream. One can put a small plant on a little stream, and the combination of little plants, each making a single part, will make the whole cheaper than a vast factory would. There are exceptions, as where casting has to be done. In such case, as at River Rouge, we want to combine the making of the metal and the casting of it, and also we want to use all of the waste power. This requires a large investment and a considerable force of men in one place. But such combinations are the exception rather than the rule, and there would not be enough of them seriously to interfere with the process of breaking down the concentration of industry. Industry will decentralize. There is no city that would be rebuilt as it is were it destroyed, which fact is in itself a confession of our real estimate of our cities. The city had a place to fill, a work to do. Doubtless, the country places would not have approximated their livableness had it not been for the cities. By crowding together, men have learned some secrets. They would never have learned them alone in the country. Sanitation, lighting, social organization, all these are products of men's experience in the city. But also, every social ailment from which we today suffer originated and centers in the big cities. You will find the smaller communities living along in unison with the seasons, having neither extreme poverty nor wealth, none of the violent plagues of upheave and unrest which afflict our great populations. There is something about a city of 1,000,000 people which is untamed and threatening. 30 miles away, happy and contented villages read of the ravings of the city. A great city is really a helpless mass. Everything it uses is carried to it. Stop transport and the city stops. It lives off the shelves of stores. The shelves produce nothing. The city cannot feed, clothe, warm, or house itself. City conditions of work and living are so artificial that instincts sometimes rebel against their unnaturalness. And finally, the overhead expense of living or doing business in the great cities is becoming so large as to be unbearable. It places so great a tax upon life that there is no surplus over to live on. The politicians have found it easy to borrow money, and they have borrowed to the limit. Within the last decade, the expense of running every city in the country has tremendously increased. A good part of that expense is for interest upon money borrowed. The money has gone either into non-productive brick, stone, and mortar, or into necessities of city life, such as water supplies and sewage systems, at far above a reasonable cost. The cost of maintaining these works, the cost of keeping in order great masses of people and traffic, is greater than the advantages derived from community life. The modern city has been prodigal. It is today bankrupt, and tomorrow it will cease to be. The provision of a great amount of cheap and convenient power, not all at once, but as it may be used, will do more than anything else to bring about the balancing of life and the cutting of the waste which breeds poverty. There is no single source of power. It may be that generating electricity by a steam plant at the mine mouth will be the most economical method for one community. Hydroelectric power may be the best for another community, but certainly in every community there ought to be a central station to furnish cheap power. It ought to be held as essential as a railway or a water supply, and we could have every great source of power harnessed and working for the common good, were it not that the expense of obtaining capital stands in the way. I think that we shall have to revise some of our notions about capital. Capital that a business makes for itself, that is employed to expand the workman's opportunity and increase his comfort and prosperity, and that is used to give more and more men work, at the same time reducing the cost of service to the public, that sort of capital, even though it be under single control, is not a menace to humanity. It is a working surplus held in trust and daily use for the benefit of all. The holder of such capital can scarcely regard it as a personal reward. No man can view such a surplus as his own, for he did not create it alone. It is the joint product of his whole organization. The owner's idea may have released all the energy and direction, but certainly it did not supply all the energy and direction. Every workman was a partner in the creation. No business can possibly be considered only with reference to today and to the individuals engaged in it. It must have the means to carry on. The best wages ought to be paid. A proper living ought to be assured every participant in the business, no matter what his part. But, for the sake of that business's ability to support those who work in it, a surplus has to be held somewhere. The truly honest manufacturer holds his surplus profits in that trust. Ultimately, it does not matter where this surplus be held, nor who controls it. It is its use that matters. Capital that is not constantly creating more and better jobs is more useless than sand. Capital that is not constantly making conditions of daily labor better and the reward of daily labor more just is not fulfilling its highest function. The highest use of capital is not to make more money, but to make money do more service for the betterment of life. Unless we in our industries are helping to solve the social problem, we are not doing our principal work. We are not fully serving. End of chapter 13. Of My Life and Work. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adam Marsatich, Alexandria, Virginia, June 2010. My Life and Work by Henry Ford, in collaboration with Samuel Crowther. Chapter 14. The Tractor and Power Farming. It is not generally known that our tractor, which we call the Fordson, was put into production about a year before we had intended, because of the Allies' wartime food emergency, and that all of our early production, aside, of course, from the trial and experimental machines, went directly to England. We sent in all 5,000 tractors across the sea in the critical 1917 to 18 period, when the submarines were busiest. Every one of them arrived safely, and officers of the British Government have been good enough to say that without their aid England could scarcely have met its food crisis. It was these tractors, run mostly by women, that ploughed up the old estates and golf courses and let all England be planted and cultivated without taking away from the fighting man power or crippling the forces in the munitions factories. It came about in this way. The English Food Administration, about the time that we entered the war in 1917, saw that, with the German submarines torpedoing a freighter almost every day, the already low supply of shipping was going to be totally inadequate to carry the American troops across the seas to carry the essential munitions for these troops and the Allies, to carry the food for the fighting forces, and at the same time carry enough food for the home population of England. It was then that they began shipping out of England the wives and families of the colonials, and made plans for the growing of crops at home. The situation was a grave one. There were not enough draft animals in all England to plough and cultivate land to raise crops in sufficient volume to make even a dent in the food imports. Power farming was scarcely known, for the English farms were not, before the war, big enough to warrant the purchase of heavy, expensive farm machinery, and especially with agricultural labor so cheap and plentiful. Various concerns in England made tractors, but they were heavy affairs and mostly run by steam. There were not enough of them to go around. More could not easily be made, for all the factories were working on munitions, and even if they had been made they were too big and clumsy for the average field and in addition required the management of engineers. We had put together several tractors at our Manchester plant for demonstration purposes. They had been made in the United States and merely assembled in England. The Board of Agriculture requested the Royal Agricultural Society to make a test of these tractors and report. This is what they reported. At the request of the Royal Agricultural Society of England, we have examined two Ford tractors, rated at 25 horsepower, at work ploughing. First, cross-ploughing a fallow of strong land in a dirty condition, and subsequently in a field of lighter land which had seeded itself down into rough grass, and which afforded every opportunity of testing the motor on the level and on a steep hill. In the first trial, a 2-furrow Oliver plough was used, ploughing on average 5 inches deep with a 16-inch wide furrow. A 3-furrow cockshut plough was used at the same depth with the breast pitched 10 inches. In the second trial, the 3-furrow plough was used, ploughing an average of 6 inches deep. In both cases, the motor did its work with ease, and on a measured acre the time occupied was 1 hour 30 minutes, with a consumption of 2 gallons of paraffin per acre. The results we consider very satisfactory. The ploughs were not quite suitable to the land, and the tractors, consequently, were working at some disadvantage. The total weight of the tractor, fully loaded with fuel and water, as weighed by us, was 23 1/4 centimweights. The tractor is light for its power, and, consequently, light on the land, is easily handled, turns in a small circle, and leaves a very narrow headland. The motor is quickly started up from cold on a small supply of petrol. After these trials we proceeded to Messrs. Ford's works at Trafford Park, Manchester, where one of the motors had been sent to be dismantled and inspected in detail. We find the design of ample strength and the work of first-rate quality. We consider the driving wheels rather light, and we understand that a new and stronger pattern is to be supplied in future. The tractor is designed purely for working on the land, and the wheels, which are fitted with spuds, should be provided with some protection to enable them to travel on the road when moving from farm to farm. Bearing the above points in mind, we recommend, under existing circumstances, that steps be taken to construct immediately as many of these tractors as possible. The report was signed by Professor W. E. Dalby and F. S. Courtney, Engineering; R. N. Greaves, Engineering and Agriculture; Robert W. Hobbs and Henry Overman, Agriculture; Gilbert Greenall, Honorary Directors, and John E. Cross, Steward. Almost immediately after the filing of that report we received the following wire: "Have not received anything definite concerning shipment necessary steel and plant for Cork factory. Under best circumstances, however, Cork factory production could not be available before next spring. The need for food production in England is imperative, and larger quantity of tractors must be available at earliest possible date for purpose breaking up existing grassland and ploughing for fall wheat. Am requested by high authorities to appeal to Mr. Ford for help. Would you be willing to send Sorensen and others with drawings of everything necessary, loaning them to British Government so that parts can be manufactured over here and assembled in Government factories under Sorensen's guidance? Can you assure you positively this suggestion is made in national interest, and if carried out will be done by the Government for the people with no manufacturing or capitalist interest invested, and no profit being made by any interests whatever? The matter is very urgent. Impossible to ship anything adequate from America because many thousand tractors must be provided. Ford tractor considered best and only suitable design. Consequently national necessity entirely dependent Mr. Ford's design. My work prevents me coming America to present the proposal personally. Urge favorable consideration and immediate decision because every day is of vital importance. You may rely on manufacturing facility for production here under strictest impartial government control. Would welcome Sorensen and any and every other assistance and guidance you can furnish from America. Cable reply, Perry, care of Harding, Prodome, London." Prodome. I understand that its sending was directed by the British Cabinet. We at once cabled our entire willingness to lend the drawings, the benefit of what experience we had to date, and whatever men might be necessary to get production under way, and on the next ship sent Charles E. Sorensen with full drawings. Mr. Sorensen had opened the Manchester plant and was familiar with English conditions. He was in charge of the manufacture of tractors in this country. Mr. Sorensen started at work with the British officials to the end of having the parts made and assembled in England. Many of the materials which we used were special and could not be obtained in England. All of their factories equipped for doing casting and machine work were filled with munition orders. It proved to be exceedingly difficult for the ministry to get tenders of any kind. Then came June, and a series of destructive air raids on London. There was a crisis. Something had to be done, and finally, after passing to and fro among half the factories of England, our men succeeded in getting the tenders lodged with the ministry. Lord Milner exhibited these tenders to Mr. Sorensen. Taking the best of them, the price per tractor came to about $1,500 without any guarantee of delivery. "That price is all out of reason," said Mr. Sorensen. "These should not cost more than $700 apiece." "Can you make 5,000 at that price?" asked Lord Milner. "Yes," answered Mr. Sorensen. "How long will it take you to deliver them?" "We will start shipping within 60 days." They signed a contract on the spot, which, among other things, provided for an advance payment of 25% of the total sum. Mr. Sorensen cabled us what he had done, and took the next boat home. The 25% payment was, by the way, not touched by us until the entire contract was completed. We deposited it in a kind of trust fund. The tractor works was not ready to go into production. The Highland Park plant might have been adapted, but every machine in it was going day and night on essential war work. There was only one thing to do. We ran up an emergency extension to put our plant at Dearborn, equipped it with machinery that was ordered by telegraph and mostly came by express, and in less than 60 days the first tractors were on the docks in New York in the hands of the British authorities. They delayed in getting cargo space, but on December 6, 1917, we received this cable: London, December 5, 1917. Sorensen, Fordson, F.R. Dearborn. First tractors arrived. When will Smith and others leave? Cable. Perry. The entire shipment of 5,000 tractors went through within 3 months, and that is why the tractors were being used in England long before they were really known in the United States. The planning of the tractor really antedated that of the motor car. Out on the farm, my first experiments were with tractors, and it will be remembered that I was employed for some time by a manufacturer of steam tractors, the big heavy road and thresher engines, but I did not see any future for the large tractors. They were too expensive for the small farm, required too much skill to operate, and were much too heavy as compared with the pull they exerted, and anyway, the public was more interested in being carried than in being pulled. The horseless carriage made a greater appeal to the imagination. And so it was that I practically dropped work upon a tractor until the automobile was in production. With the automobile on the farms, the tractor became a necessity, for then the farmers had been introduced to power. The farmer does not stand so much in need of new tools as of power to run the tools that he has. I have followed many a weary mile behind a plow, and I know all the drudgery of it. What a waste it is for a human being to spend hours and days behind a slowly moving team of horses when in the same time a tractor could do 6 times as much work. It is no wonder that, doing everything slowly and by hand, the average farmer has not been able to earn more than a bare living, while farm products are never as plentiful and cheap as they ought to be. As in the automobile, we wanted power, not weight. The weight idea was firmly fixed in the minds of tractor makers. It was thought that excess weight meant excess pulling power, that the machine could not grip unless it were heavy. And this in spite of the fact that a cat has not much weight and is a pretty good climber. I have already set out my ideas on weight. The only kind of tractor that I thought worth working on was one that would be light, strong, and so simple that anyone could run it. Also, it had to be so cheap that anyone could buy it. With these ends in view, we worked for nearly 15 years on a design and spent some millions of dollars in experiments. We followed exactly the same course as with the automobile. Each part had to be as strong as it was possible to make it, the parts had to be few in number, and the whole had to admit of quantity production. We had some thought that perhaps the automobile engine might be used, and we conducted a few experiments with it, but finally we became convinced that the kind of tractor we wanted and the automobile had practically nothing in common. It was the intention from the beginning that the tractor should be made as a separate undertaking from the automobile and in a distinct plant. No plant is big enough to make two articles. The automobile is designed to carry, the tractor is designed to pull, to climb. And that difference in function made all the difference in the world in construction. The hard problem was to get bearings that would stand up against the heavy pull. We finally got them, and a construction which seems to give the best average performance under all conditions. We fixed upon a 4-cylinder engine that is started by gasoline but runs thereafter on kerosene. The lightest weight that we could attain with strength was 2,425 pounds. The grip is in the lugs on the driving wheels, as in the claws of the cat. In addition to its strictly pulling functions, the tractor, to be of the greatest service, had also to be designed for work as a stationary engine so that when it was not out on the road or in the fields it might be hitched up with a belt to run machinery. In short, it had to be a compact, versatile power plant, and that it has been. It has not only plowed, harrowed, cultivated, and reaped, but it has also threshed, run grist mills, saw mills, and various other sorts of mills, pulled stumps, plowed snow, and done about everything that a plant of moderate power could do from sheep shearing to printing a newspaper. It has been fitted with heavy tires to haul on roads, with sledge runners for the woods and ice, and with rimmed wheels to run on rails. When the shops in Detroit were shut down by coal shortage, we got out the Dearborn Independent by sending a tractor to the electrotyping factory, stationing the tractor in the alley, sending up a belt 4 stories, and making the plates by tractor power. Its use in 95 lines of service has been called to our attention, and probably we know only a fraction of the uses. The mechanism of the tractor is even more simple than that of the automobile, and it is manufactured in exactly the same fashion. Until the present year, the production has been held back by the lack of a suitable factory. The first tractors had been made in the plant at Dearborn, which is now used as an experimental station. That was not large enough to affect the economies of large-scale production, and it could not well be enlarged, because the design was to make the tractors at the River Rouge plant, and that, until this year, was not in full operation. Now that plant is completed for the making of tractors. The work flows exactly as with the automobiles. Each part is a separate departmental undertaking, and each part as it is finished joins the conveyor system which leads it to its proper initial assembly and eventually into the final assembly. Everything moves and there is no skilled work. The capacity of the present plant is 1,000,000 tractors a year. That is the number we expect to make, for the world needs inexpensive, general utility power plants more now than ever before, and also it now knows enough about machinery to want such plants. The first tractors, as I have said, went to England. They were first offered in the United States in 1918 at $750. In the next year, with the higher costs, the price had to be made $885. In the middle of the year, it was possible again to make the introductory price of $750. In 1920, we charged $790. In the next year, we were sufficiently familiar with the production to begin cutting. The price came down to $625, and then in 1922, with the River Rouge plant functioning, we were able to cut to $395. All of which shows what getting into scientific production will do to a price. Just as I have no idea how cheaply the Ford automobile can eventually be made, I have no idea how cheaply the tractor can eventually be made. It is important that it shall be cheap, otherwise power will not go to all the farms, and they must all of them have power. Within a few years, a farm depending solely on horse and hand power will be as much of a curiosity as a factory run by a treadmill. The farmer must either take up power or go out of business. The cost figures make this inevitable. During the war, the government made a test of a Fordson tractor to see how its costs compared with doing the work with horses. The figures on the tractor were taken at the high price plus freight. The depreciation and repair items are not so great as the report sets them forth, and even if they were, the prices are cut in halves, which would therefore cut the depreciation and repair charge in halves. These are the figures. Cost, Fordson, $880. Wearing life, 4,800 hours at 4/5 acre per hour, 3,840 acres. 3,840 acres at $880. Depreciation per acre 0.221. Repairs for 3,840 acres $100 per acre 0.026. Fuel cost, kerosene at 19 cents, 2 gallons per acre, 38 cents. 1 gallon oil per 8 acres. Per acre, 0.075. Driver, $2 per day, 8 acres. Per acre, 0.25. Cost of plowing with Fordson per acre, 0.95. 8 horses cost $1,200. Working life, 5,000 hours at 4/5 acre per hour, 4,000 acres. 4,000 acres at $1,200. Depreciation of horses per acre, 30. Feed per horse, 40 cents, 100 working days. Per acre, 40. Feed per horse, 10 cents a day, 265 idle days. Per acre, 2.65. 2 drivers, 2 gang plows at $2 each per day per acre, .50. Cost of plowing with horses per acre, 1.46. At present costs, an acre would run about 40 cents, only 2 cents representing depreciation and repairs. But this does not take account of the time element. The plowing is done in about 1/4 the time, with only the physical energy used to steer the tractor. Plowing has become a matter of motoring across a field. Farming in the old style is rapidly fading into a picturesque memory. This does not mean that work is going to remove from the farm. Work cannot be removed from any life that is productive, but power farming does mean this: drudgery is going to be removed from the farm. Power farming is simply taking the burden from flesh and blood and putting it on steel. We are in the opening years of power farming. The motor car wrought a revolution in modern farm life, not because it was a vehicle, but because it had power. Farming ought to be something more than a rural occupation. It ought to be the business of raising food. And when it does become a business, the actual work of farming the average sort of farm can be done in 24 days a year. The other days can be given over to other kinds of business. Farming is too seasonal an occupation to engage all of a man's time. As a food business, farming will justify itself as a business if it raises food in sufficient quantity and distributes it under such conditions as will enable every family to have enough food for its reasonable needs. There could not be a food trust if we were to raise such overwhelming quantities of all kinds of food as to make manipulation and exploitation impossible. The farmer who limits his planting plays into the hands of the speculators. And then, perhaps, we shall witness a revival of the small flour milling business. It was an evil day when the village flour mill disappeared. Cooperative farming will become so developed that we shall see associations of farmers with their own packing houses in which their own hogs will be turned into ham and bacon, and with their own flour mills in which their grain will be turned into commercial foodstuffs. Why a steer raised in Texas should be brought to Chicago and then served in Boston is a question that cannot be answered as long as all the steers the city needs could be raised near Boston. The centralization of food manufacturing industries, entailing enormous costs for transportation and organization, is too wasteful long to continue in a developed community. We shall have as great a development in farming during the next 20 years as we have had in manufacturing during the last 20. End of chapter 14.